Imagine you are standing in the main terminal at John F. Kennedy International Airport in the late 1980s, and the building hums with a particular confidence. The planes outside bear a blue globe on their tails. The flight attendants in their Adolfo-designed uniforms move through the gate areas with the ease of people who believe, without reservation, that they work for the greatest airline in the world. The stock has had good years. The lounges are full. The name Pan American World Airways still carries the electric charge of a civilization at full sail. Then the lights go out. On December 4, 1991, Pan American World Airways filed for bankruptcy and ceased all operations. The planes stopped. The phones went quiet. 40,000 people, baggage handlers, pilots, reservationists, mechanics who had given 20 years to a single company, were told in the bluntest possible way that it was over. One of the most famous brands in the history of commerce simply stopped existing. The question worth asking is not whether Pan Am failed. The question is how a company that once defined American ambition managed to engineer its own destruction across 4 decades while its leadership, intelligent, credentialed, deeply experienced people, watched and believed, almost until the end, that recovery was still possible. The story begins, as so many American stories do, with a young man who could see something others couldn't. Juan Terry Tripp founded Pan American Airways in 1927 with a mail contract between Key West and Havana, a distance of 90 miles, barely a morning's drive today. But Tripp understood something essential about the 20th century. The world was about to get much smaller, and whoever built the infrastructure to connect it would occupy a position of extraordinary power. He was right. Within a decade, Pan Am was flying to every continent except Antarctica. Tripp negotiated landing rights that no other American carrier held, cultivated relationships with foreign governments, and positioned his airline not merely as a transportation business, but as an instrument of American foreign policy and prestige. When the State Department needed an unofficial ambassador in a foreign capital, Pan Am was often already there, operating out of a gleaming terminal that suggested permanence. By the 1960s, Pan Am was the dominant American flag carrier on international routes. Its revenue exceeded $1 billion. It occupied the top floors of a tower in Midtown Manhattan, a building that bore its name on the marquee, visible from Park Avenue. Employees spoke of working there the way earlier generations spoke of working for the railroad, with the sense that they had joined something that would outlast them. The culture was one of institutional pride shading, at times, into institutional certainty, a belief that Pan Am had not merely earned its position, but somehow deserved it, that the logic of its dominance was self-evident and self-sustaining. This is the kind of culture that produces extraordinary results for decades. It is also the kind of culture that makes certain questions very difficult to ask. In the early 1970s, Juan Tripp made a decision that would define the next 20 years of the company's history. He placed an order for 25 Boeing 747 aircraft, wide-body jets that could carry more than 400 passengers, roughly twice the capacity of anything then in service. The 747 was, by any measure, an engineering marvel, and Tripp believed it would do to air travel what Henry Ford had done to the automobile: democratize it, bring it within reach of the middle class, and in doing so expand the market beyond anything previously imagined. He was not wrong about the plane. He was not wrong about the market, but the decision carried within it an assumption so deeply embedded that almost nobody in the room thought to name it, let alone challenge it. The assumption was this: that the regulatory environment governing American aviation would remain essentially unchanged. At the time, this seemed less like an assumption than a simple description of reality. The Civil Aeronautics Board had controlled airline routes and fares in the United States since 1938. The system was restrictive, bureaucratic, and inefficient, but it was also stable and, for established carriers, protective. Pan Am's position in international markets was guaranteed by government-negotiated bilateral agreements. Its competitors faced the same constraints it did. The market was not exactly free, but it was predictable, and predictability was the foundation on which Tripp's 747, order rested. The 747s were optimized for long-haul, high-capacity international routes, exactly the routes Pan Am dominated. They were expensive to operate on short hops. Their economics required high load factors on long distances. They were, in the language of strategy, a perfect fit for the world as it existed in 1970. In the meetings where this decision was made, the arguments in favor were coherent and well supported. Fuel was cheap. International travel was growing. Pan Am had relationships and landing rights that competitors could not easily replicate. The 747 would give the airline a structural cost advantage on routes where its position was already strong. If there were voices in those rooms urging caution, and there were, including some board members who worried about the debt load, they were operating on instinct rather than data, and instinct loses most arguments against a well-constructed financial model. What the model could not account for was the Airline Deregulation Act of 1978. When President Carter signed that legislation, the CAB's authority over domestic routes and fares began a 4-year wind-down toward total elimination. New carriers could enter markets freely. Existing carriers could compete on price. The orderly, protected structure that had governed American aviation for 40 years dissolved, and in its place came something far more turbulent and far more dangerous for a company carrying the debt load that Pan Am now carried. There was another problem, one that the 747 order had quietly crystallized. Pan Am had never built a serious domestic route network. It was an international carrier, spectacularly good at flying between continents, structurally absent from the domestic market that now became the arena where competitors would build the financial base to undercut it on every route that mattered. American, United, Delta, these carriers could feed their international operations with domestic passengers. Pan Am had no such feeder system. Its 747s, those gleaming monuments to Tripp's vision, needed to be filled on every flight, and without domestic feed, filling them grew harder every year. The years between 1978 and the mid-1980s represent the period when Pan Am's fate was arguably still open. The damage was real but not yet irreversible. The airline tried. It acquired National Airlines in 1980 for $437 million, a transaction intended to give it the domestic network it had never built, and overpaid badly in the assessment of many analysts at the time, taking on debt at precisely the moment when debt was most dangerous. The domestic routes it acquired through National never integrated cleanly with its international operations. The cultures clashed. The costs compounded. Fuel prices, which had been reliably low through most of Pan Am's expansion, spiked dramatically following the oil shocks of the 1970s and remained volatile through the 1980s. A wide-body fleet that had looked economical at one fuel price looked catastrophic at another. Every percentage point increase in fuel cost fell disproportionately on an airline flying the longest routes with the heaviest aircraft. Then, on December 21, 1988, a bomb destroyed Pan Am Flight 103 over Lockerbie, Scotland, killing all 259 people aboard and 11 on the ground. The attack was an act of terrorism directed at the airline, and its consequences extended far beyond the immediate horror. Bookings collapsed. Corporate travel accounts that had specified Pan Am flights quietly respecified them. The reputational damage was severe, and, for an airline already fighting for its life, nearly unsurvivable. What followed was a cascading series of asset sales that read, in retrospect, like a patient selling off organs to stay alive. The Pan Am building, that tower on Park Avenue, the one with the name in lights, was sold. The Pacific routes, which represented some of the most valuable long-haul international traffic in the world, were sold to United Airlines in 1985 for $750 million. The sale generated cash and temporarily improved the balance sheet. It also stripped away the routes best suited to the 747 fleet and left Pan Am increasingly dependent on transatlantic traffic alone. With every asset sale, the recovery scenario required to justify the remaining debt load grew more heroic. Leadership changed repeatedly through these years. Strategies were announced and revised. Cost-cutting programs were implemented with genuine seriousness and genuine effect, and still the losses mounted. The problem was not that the people running Pan Am were incompetent. The problem was that the decisions made in the early 1970s had created a structural mismatch between the company's capabilities and the market that actually existed, and structural mismatches of that magnitude do not respond to operational improvements alone. There is a particular cruelty in watching a company in this phase. The people inside it are working hard. They are not deluded in any simple way. They can see the numbers. They understand that things are serious. What they cannot fully see, what is almost impossible to see from inside any organization that has been dominant, is that the category of solutions available to them is insufficient for the scale of the problem. They are optimizing a machine whose fundamental design is no longer suited to the terrain. By the summer of 1991, Pan Am had sold most of what could be sold. The transatlantic routes remained, along with a Caribbean operation and a shuttle service on the East Coast. Delta Airlines was in negotiations to acquire the transatlantic routes and several related assets in a transaction valued at approximately $1.4 billion. The deal was signed. Delta would take the routes, the aircraft, the Frankfurt hub, and a portion of the workforce. What remained after the Delta transaction was not, by any reasonable assessment, a viable airline, but the formal end did not come until December. On the morning of December 4, 1991, employees arrived at work and were told that operations would cease that day. Some learned from colleagues, some learned from news broadcasts. In the terminals, passengers holding Pan Am tickets were stranded or redirected. In the operations centers, people who had planned their careers around this company began the quiet, disorienting process of understanding that there would be no next shift. The losses recorded in Pan Am's final years ran into the billions. The pension obligations, what the company owed to the people who had built it, were not fully met. Retirees who had counted on those pensions found themselves dependent on the Federal Pension Benefit Guaranty Corporation for a fraction of what they had been promised. The financial cost was enormous and measurable. The human cost was distributed quietly across thousands of lives and does not appear in any balance sheet. The obvious lesson that Pan Am failed to adapt to deregulation is true, but it is not the lesson worth carrying forward. Airlines across the industry struggled with deregulation. Many adapted. Pan Am did not, and the reason is more specific and more transferable than the general observation about change. Pan Am fell into a trap that afflicts successful organizations more reliably than struggling ones. It built an extraordinarily refined capability for a specific version of the world, and when that version of the world changed, the refinement itself became the obstacle. The airline did not merely operate 747s on long international routes. It had organized its finances, its culture, its relationships, its self-conception around being the company that operated 747s on long international routes. Changing that wasn't a strategic adjustment, it required dismantling what the organization understood itself to be. This is different from the failure to innovate story that gets told about most fallen companies. Pan Am was not asleep. It was, in a meaningful sense, too awake, too committed to the logic of its own success to perceive that the conditions producing that success had been permanently altered. The 747 order wasn't a mistake made in ignorance. It was a mistake made in confidence, by people who had been right about big bets before and had learned, from experience, to trust their own judgment. That earned confidence is the most dangerous state for any organization to be in. The question any leadership team should ask, not occasionally, but routinely, is not what are we doing well. It is what assumption, if it proved wrong, would make our current strategy fatal. In Pan Am's case, the assumption was regulatory stability. It was not hidden. It was simply not named, because naming it would have required imagining a world that, until 1978, had given no serious indication it was coming. The Pan Am name survives, in attenuated form, attached to a regional carrier and a collection of branded goods, luggage, clothing, accessories sold on the nostalgia of a brand that once meant something. The Globetail logo appears on lifestyle products. the World Port Terminal at JFK, that cantilevered marvel of mid-century design where the airline once processed millions of passengers, was demolished in 2013. What remains is a kind of cautionary architecture, the outline of a company that solved a real problem, built real things, and was brought low not by a single dramatic failure, but by the slow, compounding consequences of having been too certain, too early, about what the future would require. The most honest epitaph for Pan Am may be this: it was destroyed not by its weaknesses, but by the weaponization of its strengths, applied, at full force, against a world that had quietly changed the rules.